You ready, Magdalena?
Sounds good. Let's get going.
Okay, welcome everyone. We're really excited you're here. This is our very first H&R L&D webinar series. And for those who, like the acronyms explain, which is myself, L&D is learning and development. We're gonna go really fast today. We got a lot of content and I'm excited to have my teammate Magdalena here.
Thanks for having me.
So before we start, we'd like to acknowledge with gratitude that we live and work and play on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples. And for those joining us from outside of Canada, we are from the lower mainland of British Columbia. So for you, that's Pacific Northwest, but for us, it's the south coast of our western part of the country. And today I'm really honored to have Magdalena Blasiak joining us. She is a wonderful valued colleague and friend and a fantastic leadership coach and project manager. Thanks for joining us, Magdalena.
Thanks for having me.
So a couple things before we get started. We'd love for you to participate. It's all about engagement, and please have your chat open. Our lovely colleague Raquel will be helping you answer questions or if you have any technical difficulties. And you can also submit Q&A questions. It's a little different than the chat. Those are two ways you can participate. You can do so anonymously if you choose. And we're going to launch a few polls today, so make sure you vote, and they're going to go really fast, so get ready. If you have anything you'd like to add, or if you're a bit shy to ask questions, you can always just chat to Raquel and she can send those to us. Okay, here we get started. We're going to do a lot today. Our goal, though, is to provide you with H&R and learning and development support, because we want to focus on helping nonprofit organizations do what you do even better. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to explore concrete strategies, there we go, to navigate change with 5 analogies on how to lead your teams effectively. We're going to have a little fun with the analogies, and we're going to reflect on just the leadership journey and the complexity of that by providing you with some actionable takeaways. Okay, so as I said, this is our very first in this series. Just a little snapshot of why we're doing this. Why are we offering this for free? Well, it's really important for us that we provide learning and development for all levels of nonprofit organizations. And what that looks like is something that I wish, and I know Magdalena also wished that we had when we were, volunteers or new employees of nonprofits, or even now as board members, we wish we had access to a little bit more support. So what we'd like to do is provide you with our expertise and our experience to support your teams internally, so you can then deliver much better and more impactful education externally to your constituents. And the way we're going to do that is throughout these series provide some very sound, evidence-based H&R practices and learning and development strategies. Okay. And just a really quick little bit of a plug here. The reason we like to work with nonprofits is that they're agile and lean, they're accountable to their constituents and cause-driven, and we really want to support that type of work. We also notice, though, that nonprofits are often focused more on delivering the programs and services that they have instead of focusing on their internal teams and providing them with the support they need. And that's due to, like budgets are tight, and sometimes digital skills may be sort of on the back burner. But as we've seen with the recent pandemic, this is the time for all teams to shift and learn and develop quickly. All right, let's get into our analogies. And before we do that, being the learning and development person that I am, I'm always going to tell you a little bit about why we're doing something. That metacognition piece is so important in learning as adult learners. And just so you know, the word analogies can also mean metaphors, imagery, stories, anything that helps us connect the new to something we already know. And that's really important because that helps us connect to existing schemas in the brain. So here we have a lovely image of our neural pathways and how we're making strong connections with those. And that's what we want to do today, is help you with a really clear analogy to help you link to a new way of leading, or perhaps a newer way of leading that helps you sort of connect these abstract conceptual concepts. And analogies are also great in learning because they aid in retention and recall, and they support behavior change, which is what we do as learning professionals. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Magdalena with this little quote to keep in mind, that the reason we're talking about analogies is to activate higher order levels of cognitive activity. So we want to support our teams in doing their best work, and that requires a lot of thinking power. So here we go. Let's launch a quick poll just to see what are some of the challenges that you face. Take it away, Magdalena.
Yeah, so in leadership and what we'll be talking about today, what are the two biggest challenges that you face when you're leading teams? And these are some of the common things that come up. So we're just curious to see what you folks are experiencing in your workplace during this time of change.
I love polls because you can see the things changing as we go. We'll probably give it a few more seconds, right? But I'm curious to see if people have issues with communication more than accountability. And try to pick two here. If you have one that you don't see, please answer it in the chat. We'd like to hear about that afterwards. Okay, do you think we've given them enough time?
I think so.
All right, how about we end the poll and launch those results for us, Raquel?
No surprise that communication is a big one. And we'll be addressing some of these pieces here too, certainly around accountability and knowledge, skills, and abilities. How fitting.
Perfect. Okay, great. I'm glad to know that, we are experiencing similar challenges. It doesn't matter what kind of team we're on, but these are mostly the common ones. So let's get you some tips right away. And thanks for sharing that, Raquel. Let's move on. Okay.
All right. So one of our first analogies that we're going to talk about is the trellis. So this idea came, it's not an original of mine. It's an idea that came from a leadership panel that I attended through Alumni UBC. And Marshall Walden, who's the president and CEO of Destination BC, was talking about this. And what struck me with it is it just made so much sense. That leadership and leading teams is like a vine, a clematis, for example, going through a trellis or a lattice like you see in the photo. And what it made me reflect on is that it's important to understand why we're growing as leaders, why we're managing our teams. So being really rooted in that why. And why are you here in leadership? That growth is never straight up. So this climbing the corporate ladder to me really doesn't exist, because in all of our journeys, we've been going side to side, learning from opportunities, having moments where we go back to school, opportunities to also grasp something that, like on a lattice, the vine grasps onto something that maybe is a new idea or new way of thinking. And finally, I think the really cool piece here too is having that opportunity to be mentored. So like a gardener will tend to the clematis. Sometimes it's great to have a mentor or a coach help you along the way in your growth. And the same goes for a team. So during a challenging time, during change, being nimble and looking at opportunities, seizing the opportunities, looking at ways to go sideways. I love this idea of the trellis. It really speaks to what truly leadership is all about.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to also speak about the trellis, but from a learning and development perspective. And that's why I love this HR L&D combo, because what we're talking about really when we support our teams is supporting them through their growth in their job, but also beyond. And it doesn't have to be just employees. We're talking about volunteers and board members, of course, too. So the trellis is beautiful because it supports you at any stage you're at in the task at hand or in your career as a whole. And that can look like a lot of cool things these days. The learning theories now are really about showing that on-the-job learning, just-in-time learning, and micro-learning are extremely impactful. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did during COVID at our place, but we have a ton of gardens and veggies growing, and we have a bunch of snow peas, and the snow peas really grow in all sorts of directions, and they really need to grab something in that moment, otherwise they're going to fall backwards and break off. So I'd like you to think about the trellis in terms of how are you as a leader scaffolding, supporting throughout on a day-to-day basis, and also, as they progress in their career. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a few seconds too. One way that we do that as learning professionals is to provide learning opportunities and training, if you like to call it that, that really promote higher level thinking. So not getting beyond just the recall and the understand, but also learning how to apply it, analyze, and then eventually create that work themselves. That is the work we ask people to do in nonprofits. And so to get them there faster, provide that trellis and that multi-directional support. All right, this next analogy number 2, is the slackline. So not a tightrope, it's very different. It's a slackline. At this point, I usually ask like, who's slackline before, but I'll just have to get you to wave something or say something in the chat. But I'd like to talk a little bit about neuroplasticity and the importance of how the brain learns. There's a lot of science that's come out in the last couple decades that has debunked what we thought about how adults learn best. It's no longer about the learning styles, or multiple intelligences. It's actually, we know how the brain learns, and it's about creating strong connections. And that's why we talked about analogies earlier. To create strong connections, it's really about changing the way your brain connects information. And that takes time. And it's often very uncomfortable. And you feel silly at first, and you might fall off the slack line. It's extremely likely that you'll fall off the first few times. So to support your team from a manager's perspective, you need to build in repetition for them to practice the things that you'd like to see. It's about building those habits. And from a learning perspective, it's about resetting the forgetting curve. So we'll talk about that in a second, but essentially what it is if you provide a formal learning or training opportunity, make sure you talk about it a lot and you just keep practicing it over and over. And the reason for that is because slacklining, unlike tightroping, is really accessible. Most people can do it. If you can walk, you can slackline. Okay, so it's fairly accessible, and that's what we like to think of when we talk about nonprofit organizations. We want to create low barrier, open up opportunities for people to learn. And it's a great mind-body exercise. So yes, you have to build muscle memory, but you also have to talk to your brain and get your brain to shift as you're on the slackline. And I wish you could see my arms, but if you've ever watched people slackline, they look a little wobbly and silly, but you'll notice their head is always straight. You have to look where you're going, not down. And you need your extremities to stay flexible, because it's very easy to overcorrect, and that's when the slack line will whip you right off. So you can take this analogy, and if you're a rock climber, you know a lot about slacklining. But slacklining is a great way to build your core. So think about, how as a leader am I getting my team to build that core muscle of keeping our eye on the prize, being flexible, and also supporting us with lots of opportunities to repeat, and build those strong connections. Take it away, Magdalena.
Awesome. So for me, the slackline is totally about progress and not perfection. And for me, the slackline analogy, when I first started thinking about it, is like, oh my goodness, I would have a lot of fear in this because it's not something that I'm familiar with, right? But it's not impossible. And that's where I think a good leadership mindset, a good team mindset comes into it, to really focus on progress and not perfection. The other piece too is, like Leah mentioned, is really keeping your eyes forward and being consistent with the eye on the prize. So steady pacing and consistently pushing forward. As a leader, that's what you need to do with your team through all the curveballs that get sent your way. So adjusting as you need to go. The other piece too, in terms of leadership here, what is really important is looking at conscious and consistent leadership. So on the next slide, please. I have a quote here from a really interesting and very powerful book called Conscious Business: How to Build Value Through Values. And leadership really is around that. And a lot of the things that you pointed out earlier in the poll talked about accountability and communication. And this quote says, "A leader who does not confront broken commitments encourages polite complacency." And that is it. As a leader, you really need to be consistent with what you expect. You need to consistently outline what our expectations are, so that you can move everybody forward, responsible for what they're doing, being really courageous in communication, all those things really fall into it, just like the courage of putting one step forward on that slack line and holding yourself accountable for what progress needs to be made.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I know we're short on time, but I want to really talk about each of these 5 analogies. They're just so rich. So why don't you tell us a bit about number 3, the seesaw?
Yeah, so the seesaw, I love the seesaw because it made me really get a little nostalgic of really experiencing that moment when you're on a seesaw as a kid. And the thing that came for me is pieces around facing some of the fears that happened, right? So being present in that moment on that seesaw as you're going up and down, finding balance and courage over comfort. The big pieces here that really come up during turbulent times is that piece around being present and facing fears. And I think this is where leadership really needs to be adjusted. In situational leadership, according to Hersley and Blanchard, effective leadership is task relevant, but most important, it adjusts with how people and what is happening in the situation. So you really need to be present to understand what is happening with your team, not managing from afar, really managing from within. And you need to go with the flow, just like the seesaw, understanding what that balance is. The other piece around leadership here that is really key is, the next slide, please, is choosing courage over comfort. And I love Dr. Brene Brown's work. And if you have a chance to read Dare to Lead, Brave Work Through Tough Conversation on Whole Hearts, it is truly amazing because it talks about that when things are bumpy, when things are imbalanced or there's highs and lows, being there engaged with your team in that seesaw is the most powerful thing that you can give them because it shows humanity, shows that you're journeying with them. Sometimes you may need to ask for help. And that builds trust. It builds accountability. It brings about loyalty, and really that journey together is really amazing.
I'm so glad that we chose some Brene Brown quotes. She is definitely one of my big time heroes, but especially right now with what the world's going through. And also from a learning perspective, choosing courage over comfort, very important, because that's when we're learning the most, is when our brain's uncomfortable and trying to find those connections. And from a learning perspective, the seesaw is a really great way for managers to remember the cadence of learning. There's an up and down, back and forth. And if you're like me and my younger sisters who tried to keep me up, and I was like, let me down, then you know that this is an important rhythm that we need to develop for our team. And so what we mean by cadence of learning is learning that's chunked out and spaced out over time is proven to be more effective. So when you're delivering learning opportunities or when you're choosing learning opportunities, don't go for those giant, big, learn once, one event and then life goes back to normal. We've seen that those aren't actually very effective. That doesn't mean that conferences and one-time learning events will be ineffective. It means that as a manager and a leader, we need to provide that cadence. So talk to your team. How did it go? Ask them how they're applying it in their job. When you have your weekly check-ins or when you're doing your team meetings, maybe on a monthly basis, especially now when we're all on Zoom, make sure you build some time in for that. And just very quickly, there's lots of learning models nowadays that really support this cadence of learning. But whatever you do, provide them learning opportunities and training that is active. And there are 2 ways you can do that. One is the 70-20-10 learning model, which is great because formal learning is really only 10% of the entire picture of how someone learns on the job. It's also about working with other people, 20%, learning from them, and 70% actually doing the work. So the more you can apply it, the more you can create structures for them to have support, mentors, job shadow, even in a remote environment like we are today, then the better it is for our learners. And the second model, really quickly, is this is a great time, as I see organizations shift to digital learning, this is the perfect time to adopt the flipped classroom model. So instead of having a lecture or some sort of presentation and then having the learners go off and do something on their own, flip it. They can join a lecture such as this through e-learning, webinars, that kind of thing, and then you can engage with them in an in-person or remote virtual kind of led facilitated discussion. So lots of ways for managers, leaders to build in their learning in a really different but engaging way to keep that cadence of the seesaw going. All right, we have two more analogies for you.
We do, and I love this analogy. Actually leads in really well from the last that you just introduced, and this is around the ER. So imagine, you know, what happens in the hospital in an ER room. If there's a patient that comes in, every single time it's a unique opportunity, and every single time a different team comes together to work on that patient, and they work quickly. They're very nimble, they're very capable, and use whatever's available to ensure that that person gets the best care. And here, I think this is such a great opportunity for understanding that sometimes teams, different people need to come together, different specialists, and oversee whatever the problem is, whatever the project is. And this is so perfect for nonprofits because so much of the time you collaborate on different projects, whether it's a fundraising project or a new capital plan campaign, where board members, grant writers, event specialists, graphic designers, like a whole slew of people come together to really work through whatever the challenge or the opportunity is. And it happens really fast. And I love this analogy because of that. It also shows that there's opportunities for succession planning when the leaders oversee and inspect younger folks learning how to be on the job and learn from the best. I mean, that was part of my experience working in nonprofit, and it was just so amazing to be there to have that sort of opportunity. What I would say here too is that it's always important to ask questions, be curious, stay in your lane in terms of what your expertise is, but really learn from others around the opportunities that you may be solving together. It is truly important to be integral parts of the whole. The next slide, please. This concept around teaming is actually taken from a scholar out of Harvard named Amy Edmondson. And what I love about this quote is, in the most innovative companies, teaming is the culture. And I think that's what's really cool. It's not stagnation, it's innovation, it's unique perspectives, it's variety, it's solving things from different angles and adapting rapidly to changing and competitive situations. So I know right now with funding issues in nonprofits, I think sometimes the nonprofits have been more resilient than others, certainly ones I've been working with over the last 4 months, because they know how to work with less. So you need to be really that piece around innovation and changing environments and using all the things that you have. So.
I am so glad that Magdalena introduced me to this analogy. And it's very recently, in the last few months, made a huge difference on my team. And so I'm going to speak about the ER from the perspective of managing a remote team, which is very pertinent nowadays, because I'm sure most of you are still working from home, right? But what we can learn from the teaming versus the team is that everybody, as Magdalena said, stays in their lane. Everyone has a profession, or they have a specialty or expertise, or they have a role on a project, right? And if you think of ER professionals, they are healthcare providers who are part of regulated professional associations. So they are accountable to a regulating body. They have to, provide care based on evidence and compassion. And ERs are also a great example of using technology when it makes sense, because they're always in the moment doing things. They don't have time for tons of tech training, but they do integrate technology, the latest innovations in medical tools when it makes sense. And they're very good at training their team. They run dry runs, they run drills, they do sort of prototypes and use cases, and they do them frequently. So again, there's that cadence of like, how often are you building in the rhythm of learning? And especially as we create remote teams, it makes a lot of sense for people who are working in isolation some of the time to know what their role is, and then to swoop in and really address a challenge, a project together in a teaming fashion. So that has really changed the way I work with my remote team, and I hope that will inspire you as well. The last one. This is my favorite one, because if you've seen any of my other webinars, I quote Dan Savage pretty often. So just for those who are not familiar with Dan Savage, he's a syndicated sex columnist, and he provides some great advice on life, love, and all the rest. In this case, we're going to use his campsite rule. And the campsite rule is very simply, when you go camping, you need to leave the campsite, you need to leave nature in a better state than when you found it. Same goes with the relationships, especially if it's a younger person or a less experienced person teaming with a more experienced or a person of authority, for example, an employer, a board, etc. So I think you get where we're going here. The question I'd like to leave you with today is, sometimes nonprofits are very concerned about providing the external support to your constituents or to deliver on your programs, but how are you leaving your volunteers, interns, employees, and board members in a better state than when they arrived? And what are they taking away with them? A lot of nonprofits provide amazing opportunities in terms of trying out different career paths, working on things that you maybe never had experience doing, or providing training for things that person, that individual may never have had access to. So again, think of the campsite rule. How are they leaving your organization, because they will one day, a better, more developed and more skilled professional?
Yeah, so for me, the campsite rule is really everything I needed to know about life I learned at camp. And it's a personal story that I'll share with you. Is when I was 15, I went to a leadership camp at the Canadian Red Cross, and I kind of got hooked on volunteering and contributing to my community through leadership and volunteering and such. And truly, it was everything that I learned about leadership started there. It was a huge part of mentorship, which I think nonprofits are exceptional at providing mentorship. It was around building fundamentals of human connection. So introducing me to the concepts of team dynamics and what does that mean? What does it mean to show up as you and who you are? Being resourceful. I mean, we've woven that resourcefulness throughout, because it's true. Nonprofits really know how to be innovative and resourceful. Being goal-oriented and working together, and having confidence to be able to work within a team for public speaking, around project management, conflict resolution, all of that stuff. So it's really been a foundational part. And I know, when you go to camp, you learn how to sometimes get your badges in archery or paddling, and you'll never really abandon those skills in your life. That will always come back. And I think that's really how this analogy is quite meaningful for me, because you do really keep those skills for life.
Well said. So we're going to wrap it up very quickly, because we'd like to have time for 1 or 2 questions if possible. But can you just summarize sort of some of the big picture things we've talked about today?
Yeah, I think, the big pieces that are takeaways around these analogies is bringing your best leader forward, understanding how to support and motivate your team, because at the end of the day, you are part of that. Choose effective learning experiences, and Leah shared a plethora of different ways of learning and the importance of each of those. During times of change, you really need to be nimble and seize opportunities, and know that you need to face those fear with courage over comfort and move forward. Illustrating concepts of building skills, scaffolding of how things are built for your team members and for yourself is important. And for me, the big one that kind of encompasses all is why. Why are you doing this work? How are you going to show up? What is your mindset when you come in and lead your team through changes?
Thank you. And one of the ways that we would encourage you to provide some of the support to your teams is by offering them some impactful but low cost, so they're very supportive e-learning experiences. And you can find those on my website. The idea is that they're written by people in nonprofits for people in nonprofits who understand what you need most to make that really impactful. So please visit our site. And of course, please reach out to Magdalena. She is an amazing leadership coach. And without her, my business and my leadership would not be where it is today. So thanks very much for your expertise as a friend and colleague. But may people reach out to you by email or Twitter? What's the best way?
Well, the best way is via email. That's my handle for Instagram, so find me there as well. And definitely check out my LinkedIn.
Great. I am also on LinkedIn. It's my favorite social platform because I like to learn things. So please join me there, and do check out both of our websites. We hope you can join us again for the next, so number 2 in our series. It's with Sean Rabel of Global Total Rewards. He is an HR and mental health operations consultant. So we'd like to give it a few minutes for questions. I know we're short on time. If you have to leave, that's fine. But if you have a question, make sure you type it in. We'll be sure to reply by email. Perhaps Raquel, you could pick 1 or 2 for us right now. What's popped up in the question and answer feed?
We haven't had a Q&A question, but we did have a few people asking if the presentation will be available.
Of course, yes. We're going to record this and we'll share it. It'll be widely available on all sorts of things, but mostly my website. And I'd be happy to share the slides with you too if you like. Nice to have those visual cues. Good question.
And just so you know, in the second question of the poll, most people voted for the ER team analogy.
Interesting. Okay, great. Yeah, we were sorry we didn't have too much time for that, but the ER team is a really good one. I'm glad that it resonated with you. So have a fantastic day. We'll let you get back to managing your teams, and we hope you'll join us for the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.